Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me on this episode of Writers at Work is Dennis Mahoney, an author and artist with a particular interest in and flair for horror and the occult. His latest novel, Our Winter Monster, is available now. Dennis's reputation has been growing since his debut novel, Fellow Mortals, was published in 2013. His third novel, 2020's Ghost Love, received rave reviews. Publishers Weekly called it a grave yet hilarious meditation on insanity, depression, companionship, and leaving everything behind, which tells us how Dennis finds horror within his characters. Without giving too much away, I'll say that his new one put a knot in the pit of my stomach within the first few pages, not because of the monster, but because of the crisis faced by the main characters. Let me tell you a bit about Our Winter Monster to expedite my conversation with Dennis. Holly and Brian are unhappy in their relationship. They've decided to take a brief vacation to a ski village to rekindle, if possible, their passion. What appears to be a blizzard threatens their trip even before they reach their destination. And here comes a monster on a Godzilla-like rampage through the village. Sheriff Kendra Book has to save Holly and Brian and the village, but she's encumbered by problems of her own. It's all there, right? In the wrong hands, the setup might have been cliched, but Dennis is a storyteller of the first degree regardless of genre. Even if you're not a horror fan, and I confess I'm not, Our Winter Monster will reward you for exploring his tale. Dennis is also the founder of the Equinox Society, a multimedia project I'm eager to learn more about. So with that, let me say, Dennis Mahoney, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
What grabbed me in Our Winter's Monster was how you communicated on an emotional level why Holly and Brian's relationship may be falling apart. You had vivid characters in a real-life crisis. I don't think I'm giving too much away by revealing that they get into an argument on their way to the ski resort that tells us they have real-life problems. What came first for you in the early stages? Holly and Brian's crisis or a rampaging monster?
I've been asked this a lot lately, and my memory is that it all came somewhat together. It began with wanting to write an outdoor winter story, and I'm not sure why that was happening, except I would say my previous book had been set entirely indoors in one building, and I think I just wanted to counter program where my brain would be for the next year and a half I was working. So somehow the snow monster and the couple appeared close enough together where I thought, that's it. There's something here, and I don't know what any of it means, and that's what I need to figure out. So fairly early, I had figured out the opening chapter of them driving in the snow and arguing. And as they began to argue, I began to understand who they were and why they may be triggered by driving in the winter, and how their problems may manifest as something beyond normal.
Yeah, even before the first blow is struck, we're dealing with psychological horror. I think once we enter Brian or Holly's space, we're not too comfortable. That's what you set out to do, to put us in the car with them.
Yes, that's a very real life phobia of mine, which I had to overcome quite a bit on the book tour last month. Driving in the snow panics me. I've lost the touch. Northeast winters got much softer than when I was growing up, and I started commuting less. I was a stay-at-home dad for 10 years. So I just lost the moves, and I lost the comfort with driving, even in minimal snow. And I had a number of very panicky scenarios driving in bad weather, and I just hated it. I hated when my wife had to go to work, when she was commuting. I would worry all day that somebody was out driving when they didn't need to. So I was able to tap that pretty quickly and get into that panicked headspace when I was writing the Brian perspective. And there were so many things going on. That opening chapter was actually one of the hardest to write, because I'm trying to introduce two characters, a setting, a tone, a point of view. I mean, so much is happening to establish what that story will be in 10 pages. And I know I did rewrites on that opening conversation endlessly before I proceeded, which I don't usually like to do. I don't like to get jammed up on a chapter without moving on. But in that particular case, I just needed to set so many right notes and feel like I knew what was happening in their heads before I could go on.
We're locked in there with Holly and Brian, and it's so effective that I really have to ask, do you really need the monster to tell Holly and Brian's story?
No, I'm sure you don't. So this would lead to a broader question of why choose something like horror? Why not write a more realist literary story, which was what my first novel was with FSG. That had no supernatural elements in it at all, although it did bend at times to the phantasmagorial at the end. One of the characters at the end of that book, one of the characters becomes pretty severely hit in the head and begins to hallucinate in a horrifying, nightmarish way in the woods. The reason I go to this material, I don't ultimately know why I connect with it. I have my entire life, and I've gone to those fantasy realms, especially the darker ones. I've said this a lot ever since seeing Darth Vader at age 6 in 1980. That just hit some button in me that was so profound that I think I've been chasing it ever since, all the way through Twin Peaks in the 90s and ongoing. Whenever something goes a little bit more, a little mystic or a little nightmarish, that just seems to hit something much deeper in me. And I think of dreams and the bizarre nature and details of what our brain naturally produces every night for reasons no one definitely fully understands. Most dreams aren't strictly realistic. They don't follow any kind of normal logic. They are powerful messages coming out that need to be heard by the conscious mind, and the conscious mind is failing to do so. So I think that's where my novels are coming from. I needed to tell the story with a snow monster, and
Right.
I don't think I would have been as successful mining whatever I was feeling at the time if I hadn't gone that way.
So let's go back to the beginning of your career then. Um, who were you reading when you were growing up? Do you remember, uh, for example, in my case, I remember the first time I read something by James M. Cain. I thought, oh, this is something I'd like to write. Who were you reading at a very early age, and who propelled you to want to be a writer?
About midway through high school, I realized I wasn't good at anything and I didn't know who I was as a person. This is not an unusual experience for a junior or sophomore in high school, but it was starting to really negatively affect me. I wasn't athletic. I wasn't a loser, but I wasn't cool. I was just kind of nothing. Dead Poets Society, the film, came out around that time, and that blew my mind, as it did to many young people at the time. And I thought that's something I might actually do and connect with. I was also meeting new people. I had a job at an ice cream store locally, and they kind of had cooler, artier kids working there. So it was a different group that was into different music. They were introducing me to stranger indie music, and a number of them were readers. And that kind of became my shtick. And I think a lot of people in high school will develop a shtick or try on a persona, and if it works and you get rewarded, you do more of it until it ceases to be the shtick. I mean, it's the fake it till you make it that we do throughout our lives, but especially I think at that formative age. At the time, I was reading all of the whatever was considered the canon, the most important classics of literature. Awful lot of older white guys. So, I mean, anything from Whitman to Shakespeare to all the usual high school books, Catcher in the Rye, Hemingway. It was all that stuff that I was connecting with hardest early on, and then I began to branch out more in college and read more varied works,
Yeah,
much more current works in college. I was actually picking up new novels instead of stuff that had been written 50 years ago.
right.
But kind of your classic young man writer in the late 80s, early 90s who wasn't reading terribly diversely, but I was definitely reading really good stuff. I mean, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man just hit me in so many ways. I'm a Mahoney. I grew up Catholic. Like there was a
Yeah.
lot that spoke to me in that book. And it was, in terms of Joycean literature, that was the more approachable one. It took me a long time to get really through Ulysses.
I'm older than you, Dennis. I've calculated that. I was I remember when Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, came out,
Mm.
and I seem to recall that everybody that I knew was reading it, regardless of what genre they preferred, or even if they were marginal readers. They just loved this book. And I know this is not true, of course, but it seemed to me that for many people, horror began the day they read Carrie.
It
Um,
could be. The Exorcist, I would say, is certainly in that realm as well. And in that time, when did The Exorcist come out? That might have been 10 years earlier, actually.
yeah, let's see. The film came out in 73.
Yeah.
The novel came out in 71. Carrie came out in 74, I think.
Carrie came out. Oh my God, it came out that early. Yeah,
But
holy cow. Stephen King. That's the year of my birth. That's how long
yeah,
Stephen's been
yeah.
having a career.
But I mean, why, I guess, why did you turn to horror as a writer?
I I suppose I stepped into it mostly through film. Originally, film being the fancy word for a lot of crap movies in the 80s, which I have an amazing affection for. So again, if you're picturing me as an adolescent in the 80s, I had parents who did not want me to watch R-rated movies until I was 17. However, I had friends who were sometimes the younger sibling, out of five, and the parents were like, "Hey, do whatever you want," and they had the VCR, and we knew which video store would rent us anything, and so we would go and you'd pick the craziest looking movie on the shelf, and I saw so many. I mean, I probably saw 80 to 90% of the essentials in the 80s, and then many of the inessentials. And I suppose all of that stuff, again, there was a version of the Darth Vader in all of that, where somehow something in it felt scary or troubling. Again, to go back to 6 years old and seeing the villain be dad, like
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
real head screw. I mean,
Oh,
like
yeah.
we're all like, oh yeah, it's the big twist in Empire Strikes Back, but to see it in 1980 at any age, I imagine must have been shocking. And then to see it when you're that young, and my wonderful father is sitting next to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I never thought that kind of thing could happen in the world.
Did
So
you?
all of those elements just spoke to me. And it was never, it's not a craving for darkness or evil or violence. It's the same reason I've been drawn to dark music my whole life. Bands like The Cure don't sound depressing to me. They sound euphoric. It's somehow that makes sense to me. Darker symphonies have always spoken to me.
Did you try your hand at screenwriting?
I have, only somewhat recently, somewhere in the last 5 years. I realized fairly quickly I would need to be a full-time screenwriter for many, many years before I felt like I was actually good at it. It's such a different format.
For sure, for
I
sure.
have the mental image of taking a novel and literally physically shaking it until most of the words fall out, and you're left with all of this white space and mostly dialogue. And it's an extraordinarily hard thing to do. I mean, the novelist's impulse is to over describe everything. And on a screenplay, ideally, you're doing exterior mansion fancy. that's it. You can't put in what the actors will do. You really aren't supposed to be putting anything in there. It is just a framework.
Right. So what led up to your first novel, Fellow Mortals? Had you written novels that didn't work?
Oh yes.
Any short fiction? How did you build towards your first novel?
So in college, I went to a school that didn't really have a writing program. Rest in peace to the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York, which just went under about 2 years ago. They did have an English department, and I went for that. I just, I didn't really have a career plan, so I thought, great, I'll just read all these great books for 4 years. I did meet the local writers on campus, and there were a few writing programs I took, and they were great. I was mostly writing on my own, so I began with really bad teenage poetry. a lot of free verse that just, one draft. And I thought, that's it. I nailed it. And I still have those books. They're the most mortifying, hilarious things in the world. I began to write short stories. I was certainly writing fiction. I was trying plays. I was doing all that in college. When I got out of college, I was still in the mindset of waiting for the unbelievable genius inspiration. I had this idea of being Amadeus as opposed to a more hardworking Salieri, which is the real world. So through a lot of my 20s, I wasn't really pursuing what I thought I was supposed to be doing, which was writing books or writing novels. Blogging had just taken off. So this is late 90s, early O's, when you could start a blog and write little creative things or write just about anything, and you'd have 500 followers in a week, and you'd have 2,000 by the end of the month, because there just wasn't a lot on the internet. And I really kind of spent my 20s writing a lot of that short form stuff, satirical writing for a website that's been running 30 years now, themorningnews.org. And somewhere in my late 20s, I feel like depression started to really hit me because I wasn't doing what I knew I should be doing. And we'll go back to Stephen King. He released On Writing, the story of how he became a writer, the nuts and bolts of what he believes the process works best as, and then it ends with his crash and his recovery. And that changed everything. I think the biggest takeaway I got from On Writing was that you can't treat it like this precious, special genius gift that you have. It's just a job. It's a craft that you've got to work at and learn the same way you'd learn how to fix a car, repair the plumbing in your home, or build a chair. And you've got to sit down with some sort of real discipline on whatever schedule is possible. So if you can't do every day, you pick the days you can, and you just clear that space. And it can be word count, it can be time, it can be anything. I often think of Raymond Carver, the short story writer from the 80s. He became a short story writer because he was working, I think, 3 jobs, and the only time he had to write was Saturday mornings. I think John Gardner was his professor, and John Gardner allowed him to use his office on Saturday mornings. So Carver would just write as fast as he could every Saturday and try to finish something. And so he just learned to write as a short story writer. But I think that's the job. So when I was approaching 30, that I began to go to the Westport Library in Westport, Connecticut after work. And I was not allowed to leave until I had written 1,000 pages. I'm sorry, 1,000 words, 1,000 pages. No, 1,000 words, which is, 3 to 4 pages typed. And I was not allowed to go home. And that changed everything. I lost the fear of the blank page, and I lost just the waiting and the inertia. And after that, I ever since, I've just been in a habit of finding days every week when I sit down and work on something.
Dennis, I think for any writer at any stage of her or his career, to take the pressure off, has to just think, this is my job. There's nothing magical about this. I'm not waiting for the muse to come. I have to produce work or I won't be paid.
Yes, or I won't be fulfilled. Getting paid enough as a writer, as a fiction writer, kind of a crazy goal. That was another breakthrough I had in my early 30s, was after I had racked up rejections and near miss rejections. Like I almost got an agent, and then I got an agent and it didn't work. The process is so long. I only get that shot every year and a half. And then you think, I didn't make it again. Am I kidding myself? That's when I really decided I have to be writing stuff that entertains me first and foremost. It's got to be something I really like doing, even when it's hard. It's got to be something I want to do. So if I'm writing to impress the literary scene or to impress an imaginary agent who might get me a book deal, I'm going to be miserable, because at that point I'm doing the job for the wrong reason, and it's the wrong job.
Right, right. I think another thing new writers or writers who are stuck fail to realize is that We have one job, which is to produce a good book, and everything else is out of our hands.
Yes.
And I think in the beginning, people tend to look to the industry as if it makes sense. It's not an industry that makes sense.
No.
It really overburdens the writer. When you're in a band, by the time you are ready to sign with a record label, you've had years of experience and lots of people helping you. And when you're an author, you show up at the publisher with a manuscript, and that's it. It's you and the big machine. Um, so I think it's maybe you agree or disagree. I don't know. Writers need to take pressure off themselves and realize that the job is to sit down and write.
I completely agree. And it's an incredibly liberating thing to know that the only process you can control, you do have 100% control over. I often feel bad for artists in other fields. I always felt bad for actors who really need somebody else. I mean, you can practice monologues all day, but the heart of acting is that interaction. So you've got to find somebody else, and ideally you've got to have an audience and a stage, or you have to have a film, or unless you're a solo musician, which can happen obviously, even a solo musician tends to need somebody else. Like there's going to be another instrument, unless you're only playing guitar and singing. Writing is so it's intimidatingly solo. It's all on you, but the upside is that it is all on you at that point. And I don't need to submit a book or let go of a book until I'm completely happy with it, and I can take as long as I want. Especially when you're not famous, no one's looking for it. Like no one
Right.
cares if you spend an extra 2 years. And even when you are famous, it often becomes more of an event. It's like, oh, so and so finally showed up with another book after 5 years, and it becomes a thing.
Yeah.
I'm always grateful that I have all the time in the world to do this, and get it right according to my standards. Because, like you said, the industry once it's out of my hands, it's gone. Like I've got some say in the edits. I mean, I've had great relationships with my editors and my agent, and my recent publisher has been heaven. Soho Press. I mean, I am just. I hope I stay there forever. But when the book comes out, it's 12 to 18 months after I have finished it, and then it's just thrown out in the world. I have no idea who's going to pick it up. I have no idea who's going to like it. And even amongst horror readers, some people have loved this new book, and others it just didn't work for them. And I've got a pretty thick skin now. I just think, well, the people who didn't like it, it wasn't for them, I guess. I don't know who it was for. I was writing for somebody who I thought would like it, or primarily I was writing because I liked it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if I get a bad review, I just think, yep, they weren't the right person. That's okay.
Yeah. I once said to Van Morrison, who did you think was going to like this album? And he said, I knew it would appeal to the people it appeals to.
Exactly.
And
That's
and you
perfect.
you can only write for people who read you, and you can only appeal to people who are willing to find what's appealing in your writing.
And
But
you
of course,
never even know if the person is going to be at the right time of their life
right,
or
right,
day. Like there's stuff that's come out where I thought like, God, this is made for me. And I will watch it or I'll read it and I'll think, yeah, it just didn't hit. And
right.
I have no idea why. I mean, like the first time I watched Stranger Things season one, I thought that this thing is built for me, like an 80s inflected nostalgia horror show. And it really fell flat for me the first time I watched it. And I've since gone back and rewatched it, and now I have a great affection for that show. But for whatever reason, that time of my life, it just didn't work, and I was like,
Let me go back to the early days of your writing. When did you have a sense that you had the ability to tell the kind of stories you wanted to? Mastery is probably overstating it. Where you had some control over your craft.
that's a really good question. I mean, there's the old 10,000 hour rule, right? And I have actually tried to calculate that, which was tough because I wasn't disciplined in writing on a regular basis for a while. It felt true for me that I had probably put in 10,000 hours of working on fiction before I felt like now something's really happening. Um, I got awfully close on this. Oh, I wrote a few really short, really terrible novels in college. Didn't really write any novels in my 20s. So then I had one, two, I want to say like two and a half by the when I was really sitting down and doing that discipline work in my early 30s. I had two and a half that didn't quite make it, but I could tell I was getting better. And
Uh-huh.
I would really say when I wrote Fellow Mortals, I thought I know how to do this to some degree. Like I've learned enough about myself and my approach to building stories. Like I felt very confident writing Fellow Mortals.
Yeah, improvement comes incrementally, I think, and we don't even know it sometimes. The story I like to tell is when I do a reading, which, as you point out, is 12 to 18 months after you've submitted your manuscript, I have wanted to edit what I've written in the middle of a reading
I
because
don't I don't like going back and rereading my work at all.
no, I think, oh, I could do this better now.
Yeah.
Um,
What I find eerie, a couple of times I've gone back and looked at, say, like my first or second book, and I've read some, and I've thought, Jesus, I'm always alarmed when it's pretty good because I think, have I not gotten better in 10 years? Like,
right,
I kind of could have written that paragraph like last week.
right. You mentioned setting earlier, and I want to talk about setting. Um, when you're thinking about a project like our Winter Monster, at what point do you think about formalizing setting?
That in particular really came all at once. Like I said, I had a sense of dangerous winter pretty early and throwing a couple into the mix. And so that was a heavy atmosphere. I wanted them in the middle of nowhere. So to make up an imaginary ski town like Pine Buck, New York, I wanted someplace where you were sort of around people. You could potentially get to a main street, but you could also be a quarter mile from almost total wilderness. So
Right.
sometimes it's just that sense of like I wanted those characters alone and scared, and like what kind of place and setting would do that. Other books have had the setting's been less important.
You have setting writ large and writ small in this book, and you handle both really well, I think. I keep talking about this opening scene, but when we're in that small space with Holly and Brian, uh, we're locked in there with them. And then we're even locked in further when the snow starts turning into a blizzard. And then we're even further locked in when Brian confesses he suffers from anxiety. But I don't think that works if they're not in the car. If the two of them are walking down the street and there's
Right.
endless space around them, this is a very effective use of small setting. And then later in the book, a horrific scene occurs in a meat locker. And Dennis, you're really good at locking us in a space with the horror.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how much of that is consciously chosen. I mean, my process in general might not be. I'd love to take credit for all of this. I've had book clubs where people will point out some amazing symmetry in one of my stories, and I'll have to do that thing like, oh yeah, right. I'm glad you noticed that, and I'm sitting there like, holy smoke, like that's absolutely in the book. I mean, you telling me right now that you equated a cookie in the freezer with Brian and Holly in the car, that never crossed my mind. Actually, I certainly did not sit down and like outline that out. Like, let's do an echo later. Um, I think this is something, boy, I feel like this is something you two said about themselves, about how they developed their particular sound because they sucked at certain things. Like Bono wasn't the kind of singer he wanted to be, so he had to develop a voice that he could pull off. And I think that's most artists. So like John Irving was always getting kind of razzed about like, oh, he's got bears in this one again. Oh, he's got a third novel with dwarves in it. And like why does he keep going back to these things? And I don't think he couldn't help himself. And I think sometimes the weaknesses that come out of the creator's inability to do everything are what actually create a voice and
Oh
create
yeah.
a personality. And I think this is where AI is going to hit its artistic creation problems, because if the bloody thing can do anything, it's not necessarily going to do anything well, or it's not going to have that weird shaggy idiosyncrasy.
Right. You talk to artists and all the time they'll say, I couldn't have done anything else. I couldn't do that, so I had to do this. And but there's Miles said, play what you can play. And what he means by that is if you play what you can play, you're going to find out you can play a lot more than you know.
Mm.
And so, yeah, you probably didn't plan that out, but some part of your writing discipline told you, uh, this works. Let me revive this. It gives the story more of a concrete connectivity. And I want to ask you, you use the present tense. Um,
I
I,
did in that book. Yeah, I
yeah, yeah.
did.
I think in a flashback scene you didn't. But what do you like about the present tense?
There's, I mean, there is an immediacy to it. It's become much more common. I know a lot of people hated it, and when it, I don't know at what point it started to emerge in so many novels, but I think it definitely has. I often, I write hearing the words in my head. Like I read out loud in my head, which makes me a somewhat slow reader. And I've been surprised to find that some people don't do this, that people can just kind of read silently without actually hearing the rhythm of the words. So when I'm writing a novel, I'm always imagining that I'm going to have to say the whole thing out loud. And on one hand, that I think naturally reduces a certain level of pretension in the poetry of the language. If I wouldn't actually say this while telling a story, it's probably me showing off, and I should get rid of it. It's going to be some style that draws unnecessary attention to itself. I'm usually trying to tell a story as if I ran into somebody at a bar and I have this great anecdote. And I'm trying to elevate it off of, well, I mean, like, to be somebody who can really, really tell an anecdote well. You meet those people sometimes. They can tell you what happened at the supermarket this morning, and it sounds like almost a short story. So I'm often approaching that. I'm listening to myself speak right now, and I'm kind of speaking in the present tense, I suppose. I mean, sometimes I speak in past tense, but I think in the present tense a lot.
Well, I think you use the word urgency, and for this story, um, it's an urgent story. I mean, we hit the ground running immediately, and we never leave the running ground. So, a more contemplative story probably wouldn't be well served by the present tense. But it's interesting that that was a deliberate decision on your behalf because it really works.
Thank you. I think Ghost Love was too. I'm trying to remember. I know I'm halfway through writing my next novel, and I made the decision to go with past tense.
You did.
And it's third person, but following those strict rules, there's always a POV character.
Right. So there's a little bit more air
Yeah.
yeah.
But it was jarring because I'd spent years. There are certain rhythms that I would prefer. So even saying he said versus he says, it does kind of screw up my ear a little bit. And there were times early on in writing this current book that I'm working on where it would lapse into present tense and then catch myself like, oh no, you got it. Because a lot of my notes were written in present tense. So I'm working off of those.
You've had success with audiobooks. Do you edit for your audiobooks? That is to say, do you strike all the he says and she says, and have you taken on that responsibility, or have you passed that on to someone else?
In both audiobook cases, they began as well, Ghost Love was written as a novel. And I had a peculiar publishing path on that one, which was I had a great agent for my second novel, Bellwether, and he just really didn't connect with Ghost Love. So suddenly he we parted amicably, but he just said he didn't think he was going to be able to represent it well. He didn't get it. He didn't like it. So suddenly I'm that writer who has no agent, and I feel like I'm starting over at age 35 or whenever that was. It was probably later, maybe 38, 40. So,
I'm laughing, Dennis, because I'm twice 35.
okay. But to suddenly feel like you're at zero in
Right, right,
midlife, like, oh
right,
my
right,
gosh.
right,
Like,
right.
I remember looking for agents when I was 20, like, I got to do this now. I thought I had made it over that phase. So I got so fed up with the whole process. I thought, let me just do this as a podcast. And I did it with a friend of mine named Sam Booty, who was getting into podcast production and audio recording, released it independently. And then once that was done, I thought, well, maybe now I'll try to get a deal. Like, it can't hurt. And I found my current agent, Stacia Decker, who I adore. I hope I never lose her. And she got me a deal at Audible. She was talking to somebody, I think she was at a book expo or something, and ran into the VP at Audible, and he really liked it. And so they produced it pretty much as a novel. They brought in 3 actors, and I think they kept the he said, she said. I know I was there for the recording. I mean, this is 4 or 5 years ago. I think they did that thing where you kind of drop it a little quietly.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
walking to the
yeah,
store, he said.
yeah, yeah.
Instead of declaring, he said.
Right.
Um, and that one worked too because it was primarily one character. Like, it was mostly a first person male character in that book, so it's not like he had a ton of conversation.
Right.
Um, yeah, I can't remember how they did the conversations though. They might have dumped some of the he said, she said on the fly.
Well, that would be a credit to them because if it wasn't noticeable, then it worked,
Right.
right? I've got to ask, what is the Equinox Society?
I don't know why I called it that, except I think I was aiming for something like the Twilight Zone.
It's pretty cool, the name.
Thank you. And it was a reboot of my career in a way. I had really lost interest in writing novels. This was around that Ghost Love phase when it wasn't coming out as a novel. And I really thought, like, God, where am I in my creative life? And the jobness of what I had learned about novel writing had started to weigh on me. It had ceased to be fun and delightful. And so I did the opposite of that Stephen King effect of, like, sit down, treat it like a craft. I had to go backwards in my mind to recapture the thrill I was feeling at 18, like when I was writing for no reason but to write. And I had no intention of sending it out into the world. I was just swimming in all of this. And as I was rediscovering all that, I really decided I wanted to start playing with visual art and I wanted to start experimenting. So I created a podcast of short fiction stories, which I hosted as a sort of Rod Serling-esque version of myself. I put that out for over the course of like 2 years. I mean, I put an incredible amount of time in that. So I was doing visual art online, again, extremely working to my limitations. So a lot of it looked like scrappy, Xeroxed punk type stuff, but all with a kind of a strange eldritch quality. Like, I was definitely leaning into horror a bit more at that point. I played with writing TV scripts. I played with writing movie scripts. And I actually originally conceived Our Winter Monster as a possible audio pitch in which 2 characters would be speaking via voicemails through the whole thing. Like, I was trying to actually think,
Oh,
what kind of story would be good to listen to? Like, it would be built for audio. And I could not make it work. Like, I could not get that to, because I kept seeing the snow. I kept seeing them. I wanted to describe certain things. It was
mhm.
getting too awkward as a gimmick. So the Equinox Society, to answer your question, was all of those things together. The podcast was called Equinox Society Radio. And I made these incredible connections with the people who were listening. It wasn't a huge audience, but they were emphatically into it. And as was I. And it was the first time in my writing career or my creation career where I had so many people that I knew who my audience was for the first time. It wasn't some random stranger that I never got to meet. It was these people who would message me through email. I was sending paper mail. I would cut up paper art, or I would come up with, like, weird little packages, and I would ask for people's addresses and literally send out 100 packages for free just so they got something to hold.
Right.
And it really reignited why I do all of this. By the time I realized Our Winter Monster wanted to be a novel, I was so relieved to I didn't have to focus on form or like, how do I write a screenplay? What software do I use? I just thought, oh, I can do anything with a novel. I can just write it now. And so the Equinox Society in general has been sort of my dark art empire that I've built for myself. And it is ongoing. I'm sure it will grow more limbs.
I want one last question, and I think you very cleverly sprinkle some clues on your blog, but you're far enough along that you know what's next.
Yes. So my writing process, I'm going to take a slightly longer answer on this because I think it'll be interesting for your your listeners. There's the argument of the constant debate. I won't say argument. Should you sit down and organically write a story unplanned because it won't be forced and it won't have all those machinations? Or should a writer outline things in advance and have some bloody idea of what they're about to get into? So to plot or not to plot. And I've gone either way over the course of my career. My process now is that I plot so hilariously intensely. Like each chapter, I will know beat by beat what's happening in a conversation. I just won't write it well. I'm kind of telling myself the story in a Word document and not worrying about the language or the elegance or the neatness. And I feel my way through a story that way and jump around. I'm much braver that way and more organic, because if I have to delete something, it's just notes. If I have to change 100 pages, it's just notes. By the time I finished this notes phase for the next book, I had 150,000 words of fairly well organized story. The novel is already shrinking close to 100. I mean, like it's now condensing and it's becoming more elegant as I write it. But my plotted phase is the worst first draft you'll ever read by anyone, but it's all there. Like I have all of the material. I know those characters. I know where this is going. I know what the themes have revealed themselves to a large degree. So now when I sit down, I'm just executing. And it's a delight to sit down and I know what I'm trying to do in this chapter. I know what I want to evoke in this character's mind. Just how do I do that best? So it's in a way, it's almost like storyboarding a film in extreme detail, shot by shot. And now I'm at the point where I actually get to go and film it. So the current book, I'm in that phase of writing, and I'm about halfway through. Like now I can crank out 1,000 words a day or more.
Great. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Dennis Mahoney, an author whose tales allow us to experience horror by bringing us deep into the psychology of his characters. Dennis, thanks so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Jim, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.